The damp chill of a London autumn clung to the brickwork of St. Jude's primary school, seeping through the tall, grimy windows of Mr. Vance's Year 2 classroom. Outside, the city hummed its relentless gray tune. Inside, the air smelled of chalk dust floor polish and the faint, earthy scent of rain-soaked coats. It was Monday morning, and the classroom buzzed with the chaotic symphony of 6-year-olds recounting their weekend adventures, a cacophony of noise and motion that Elias Vance had long learned to filter into a familiar, ambient hum. Leaning against his desk, a half-empty mug of tea warming his hands, Elias surveyed his domain. Colorful posters displaying the alphabet and multiplication tables fought for space on the walls with children's artwork, a vibrant tapestry of misshapen suns and stick-figure families. He was going through the familiar Monday morning ritual, a practiced smile on his face as he nodded at a story about a lost hamster and praised a drawing of a lopsided rocket ship. It was a routine that on most days felt like a comfortable rhythm. Today, however, it carried the dull ache of repetition. He was a teacher. Observation was his sharpest tool. And as his gaze swept across the room, it snagged on a pocket of stillness amidst the cheerful storm. Amara. She stood by her small wooden desk near the back, a space she had occupied silently for the past 3 months since arriving from a country whose name most of her classmates couldn't pronounce. Her school uniform, a navy blue cardigan and gray pinafore, was worn but immaculately clean. Her dark hair was neatly tied back from a face dominated by large, solemn eyes that seemed to hold the shadows of places he couldn't imagine. Her backpack, a bright pink thing decorated with a cartoon cat, was still slung over her shoulders, looking too large and too cheerful for her small frame. While other children jostled and chattered, pulling out pencil cases and books, Amara remained frozen. Her small hands were clenched around the straps of her bag, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at anyone, her gaze fixed on the scuffed wooden legs of the chair tucked under her desk. Elias pushed himself off his desk, the legs of his own chair scraping softly against the floor. He moved between the tables, his footsteps quiet until he stood beside her. "All right there, Amara," he asked, his voice gentle. She flinched, a tiny bird-like movement, as if his presence had startled her out of a trance. She looked up, and for a fleeting moment he saw a flicker of raw panic in her eyes before it was quickly veiled. She nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. "Time to get your things out. We're going to be reading a story about a rather silly dragon?" "In a few minutes," he said, trying to coax a reaction with a warm smile. She didn't smile back. Her lips parted, and she drew a shaky breath. The words, when they came, were so soft he almost missed them, spoken in the careful, accented English she was still piecing together. "It hurts," she whispered. The clamor of the classroom faded into a distant hum. Elias crouched down, bringing himself to her level. The scent of her strawberry-scented shampoo reached him. He looked directly into her eyes, trying to find the source of the trouble. "What hurts, sweetheart?" She bit her lower lip, a nervous habit he'd seen before. Her gaze dropped back to the floor. "When I sit. It hurts when I sit." The words were simple, a child's complaint. His mind immediately cataloged the logical explanations: a fall in the playground, a scraped knee, growing pains, any number of mundane, easily solvable childhood ailments. But it wasn't the words themselves that sent a cold prickle down his spine. It was the way she held herself rigid and braced as if expecting a blow. It was the absolute absence of a child's usual melodrama. There were no tears, no pouting, no pointed gestures to a bruised limb. There was only a quiet, profound dread that made the air around her feel heavy. "Did you fall, Amara?" he asked softly, keeping his voice even. "Did you hurt yourself at home?" She gave a small, jerky shake of her head. She wouldn't look at him. I can't sit down," she repeated, her voice a thread of sound. "It hurts." He looked at her chair, then back at her. He could offer her a cushion from the reading corner or let her sit on the soft rug. He could try to solve the physical problem, but his gut and instinct, honed over 8 years of navigating the complex emotional worlds of small children, told him this was something else entirely. This wasn't a scraped knee. This was fear, deep, cold, and absolute. "Can I stand?" she asked, the word a plea. "Please." Something in his chest tightened. A child shouldn't have to ask for permission to avoid pain with such desperate politeness. He gave her a slow, reassuring nod. Of course you can, Amara. You can stand right here next to your desk for as long as you need to. He saw the relief wash over her, a fleeting, almost imperceptible loosening of her shoulders. She didn't thank him, but her dark eyes met his for a second, and in them he saw a fragile gratitude that struck him more deeply than any words could have. As he stood up and walked back to the front of the classroom, clapping his hands to gather the attention of the other children, he couldn't shake the image of her small, tense figure. He began to read the story of the silly dragon, his voice animated and engaging, but part of his mind remained fixed on the little girl standing silently at the back of the room. He risked a glance over the top of the book. She was listening, her head cocked to one side, but her body was still a portrait of vigilance, a quiet declaration of pain in a room full of laughter. It was a discord he couldn't ignore. The simple three-word sentence echoed in his head, overriding the cheerful narrative of the storybook. "It hurts when I sit." And he knew with a chilling sense of dread that the pain Amara was talking about had very little to do with the chair. The morning break bell shrieked, releasing a wave of high-pitched energy into the corridors. Children spilled out into the concrete playground, their shouts and laughter echoing against the damp brick. Elias, however, remained in the classroom watching Amara from his desk. She hadn't gone outside. Instead, she had taken a picture book from the shelf and was standing by the window turning the pages with a slow, deliberate motion, her body still held in that same guarded posture. He had observed her all morning. She had participated in the lessons, answering when called upon in her quiet, hesitant voice. She had completed her worksheet leaning awkwardly over her desk to write. But she had not sat down. Not once. The sight was a constant gnawing unease at the edge of his thoughts. With a deep breath, he gathered himself. This couldn't wait. He asked the teaching assistant, a cheerful woman named Sarah, to keep an eye on Amara and made his way towards the administrative heart of the school, the headmistress's office. Ms. Evelyn Reed's office was the antithesis of his own chaotic classroom. Everything was immaculately organized. The mahogany desk gleamed under the cool light of a modern lamp devoid of any clutter, save for a sleek laptop and a single pristine file. Certificates in neat black frames adorned the walls, testaments to a career built on order and achievement. The air smelled of lemon polish and a faint, expensive perfume. Reed looked up as he entered, her expression neutral. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back into a severe but elegant chignon. She was known for running St. Jude's with formidable efficiency. "Elias," she said, her voice crisp. "Everything all right?" "I hope so, Evelyn," he began, closing the door behind him. "I've come to talk about one of my students, Amara Al-Jamil." She steepled her fingers, a gesture he knew meant she was shifting into professional mode. "The new girl from Syria." "Yes. Is she struggling to settle in?" "It's more than that," Elias said, stepping closer to her desk. He recounted the morning's event, keeping his voice calm and factual. "She came in this morning and told me, 'It hurts when I sit.' She refused to sit down all morning. She's standing in the classroom right now." Ms. Reed listened without interruption, her gaze unwavering. "And did you ask if she'd fallen children or always bumping into things?" "I did." She said no, and it wasn't the way she said it, Evelyn. It wasn't a complaint. It was visceral. She was terrified. Ms. Reed's expression didn't change. "Did you check for any visible injuries? A bruise on her leg, perhaps?" "No, I didn't think it was appropriate to procedure." "Elias," she cut in her tone, not unkind but firm as steel. "First we observe and inquire. Then, if there is a visible sign of injury, we contact the parents and log it in the student welfare record. Have you logged this?" "I'm logging it now by speaking to you," he countered, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "My concern is that this isn't about a simple fall." The look in her eyes, it felt like fear. Deep fear. "A feeling is not evidence," Ms. Reed stated, leaning back in her leather chair. "We must be extremely careful not to jump to conclusions. Her family are refugees. The child has been through significant trauma as noted in her file. She is in a new country, a new school. She may be acting out due to anxiety. There are a dozen plausible explanations, and one of them," Elias pressed, leaning forward slightly, "is that something is very wrong at home." A cool silence settled in the room. Ms. Reed's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "An accusation, even an implied one, is a very serious thing, Elias. It has repercussions. For the family whose legal status is already precarious, For the school, if we are seen to be making unsubstantiated claims, we have a duty of care, of course, but that duty is bound by procedure. She stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick binder labeled Safeguarding Policies. Your instructions are clear. Document everything you observe in the welfare log. Note every instance of her refusal to sit, any comments she makes, any changes in her behavior. If you see something concrete, a bruise, a direct disclosure of harm, a visible sign of distress that can be corroborated, then we escalate immediately. But until then, our hands are tied. She placed the binder on the desk between them, a solid, unyielding barrier. For now, it is a behavioral issue to be monitored. Nothing more. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. It was a dismissal wrapped in the impenetrable jargon of bureaucracy. He was being told to stand by and take notes while a child was, he felt, with every fiber of his being in pain. My concern is that by the time we have concrete proof, he said, his voice tight, significant harm may have already been done, and my concern is protecting this institution and its staff from acting on a feeling, she replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. Your instructions are clear, Mr. Vance. Defeated, he nodded and left the office, the scent of lemon polish following him out. Back in the corridor, the distant shouts of children felt a world away. He walked not to the staff room, but to a small, quiet alcove that housed a communal phone. He found the poster on the wall, the one with the bold, friendly font, "Worried about a child? Call us." He dialed the number. The voice that answered was polite, professional, and entirely detached. He explained the situation again, his words feeling thinner and less convincing over the phone line. The questions came a familiar, dispiriting echo of his conversation with Ms. Reed. Are there any visible marks, bruises, or injuries? No, Elias admitted. Has the child made a direct disclosure of abuse? Has she named a person or described an act of violence? Ooh. She just said it hurts to sit. And you've logged this concern with the school's designated safeguarding lead. The headmistress. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Thank you for your report, sir. We will log the concern under the child's name. However, without more tangible information or a direct disclosure, there aren't sufficient grounds to warrant an immediate welfare check. We recommend you continue to monitor the situation closely and report back if any new information comes to light. Elias hung up the phone, the receiver feeling heavy in his hand. He had followed procedure. He had knocked on the doors, but the walls of the system were smooth and high-built to withstand anything less than a battering ram of solid proof. And all he had was a 6-year-old's whisper and a terrible feeling in his gut. He walked back to his classroom and stood in the doorway. The break was almost over. Amara was still by the window. Her back to the room, a small, solitary figure outlined against the gray London sky. She was still standing. The walls were higher than he'd thought. He would just have to find his own way over them. The days that followed settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Elias documented everything just as Ms. Reed had instructed. In a locked file, he wrote in precise, objective language, Tuesday, Amara remained standing for all lessons. When gently encouraged to join circle time on the rug, she shook her head and retreated to the book corner. Wednesday, Amara appeared tired, dark circles under her eyes. She did not engage with other children during break, preferring to stand and watch from the edge of the playground. The notes felt sterile and inadequate, failing to capture the quiet desperation in the girl's posture or the fleeting shadows of fear in her eyes. Each entry was a testament to his own helplessness. Friday afternoon was art class, usually the most boisterous and joyful period of the week. It was a time when the strictures of literacy and numeracy loosened, allowing for pure, uninhibited expression. Elias laid out thick sheets of paper, pots of brightly colored paint, and tubs of brushes. All right, everyone, he announced, his voice cheerful. Today's theme is my favorite place. It can be anywhere you want. Your bedroom, the park, your grandma's house, even a magical castle on the moon. Show me the place that makes you feel happy and safe. A wave of excitement rippled through the classroom. Children scrambled for their favorite colors, chattering about bedrooms filled with toys and parks with giant slides. Elias moved around the room, offering encouragement and admiring the emerging creations. But his attention, as always, was drawn to the back of the room. Amara stood before her easel, a paintbrush clutched in her small hand. For a long time, she simply stood there motionless, staring at the blank white page as if it were an impassable wall. The other children's papers were already exploding with vibrant greens, sunny yellows, and brilliant blues. Her page remained untouched. Elias approached her quietly. "Need a hand getting started, Amara?" She shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the paper. Then, with a sudden decisive movement, she dipped her brush into the pot of black paint. He watched as she painted a stark, simple shape in the center of the page, a chair. It was a child's rendering, 4 straight legs, a square seat, a tall back, but it was unmistakably a chair. It was rigid and unwelcoming. Next, she took a clean brush and dipped it into the brown paint. Beside the chair, she began to paint a figure. It wasn't a person. It was a doll, a simple rag doll with button eyes, limp arms, and yarn for hair, but something was wrong with it. One of its fabric legs was bent at an impossible angle, twisted and broken. She painted the doll sitting on the severe black chair. Elias felt a chill creep up his spine. This was no happy place. His unease deepened as she reached for the next color, red. With short stabbing motions, she began to add splatters of crimson around the doll's broken leg and onto the seat of the chair. They weren't neat, controlled strokes. They were angry jabs of the brush blossoms of color that looked less like paint and more like something spilled. Then came the black again. She began to fill the space around the chair, not with the cheerful details of a room, but with thick, chaotic lines. They were dark, frantic scribbles, a vortex of black that seemed to press in on the chair and the broken doll, trapping them in a cage of darkness. The classroom was still filled with the happy chatter of children describing their fortresses and fantasy worlds. But in this corner, a different story was being told. It was a story of pain, of confinement, of something shattered. When she was finished, Amara laid the brush down with a quiet finality. She didn't look at her work with pride or satisfaction. She just stared at it, her expression unreadable. She hadn't painted a place, she had painted a feeling. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited until the bell rang and the children holding their cheerful masterpieces filed out of the room for the end of the day. Amara left her painting on the drying rack without a backward glance and slipped out of the classroom, a silent shadow disappearing into the crowded corridor. He walked over to the rack and carefully lifted the sheet of paper. It was still damp. He held it in his hands, the weight of it feeling far heavier than a simple piece of art. The button-eyed doll with its broken limb, the stark chair, the furious red, the suffocating black. It was symbolic. It was an allegory of pain written in a language a 6-year-old could speak when words failed her. This is my safe place, he had asked them to paint, and this is what she had shown him. A scene of violence, a broken thing forced to sit in its place of hurt. This was more than a feeling. This was a disclosure. It was her voice screaming from the silent page. He took the painting and walked over to the locked filing cabinet. He slid it carefully inside on top of his neat, useless log of observations. The official procedure required tangible evidence. He looked down at the disturbing, heartbreaking image. He was certain he was now holding it in his hands. 2 weeks later, the school hall was transformed for the autumn term's parent-teacher evening. The vast, echoing space, usually filled with the sounds of assemblies and gym classes, was now a low, humming hive of adult conversation. Rows of undersized chairs were arranged in front of teachers' desks, forcing parents to fold their long limbs into awkward positions. The walls were covered in the children's best work, a riot of color and joyful chaos that stood in stark contrast to the nervous, polite tension in the room. Elias sat at his designated table, a forced smile fixed on his face. He had been there for 2 hours, repeating the same practiced phrases to a conveyor belt of anxious parents. Yes, his reading is coming along nicely. She needs to focus a bit more during maths, but her effort is wonderful. A pleasure to have in the class. It was a performance of professional reassurance, and he was growing weary. His gaze kept drifting towards the queue of parents near the entrance, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He was in the middle of a conversation about lunchbox nutrition when he saw them. They stood out not because they were loud or drew attention to themselves, but because of the charged stillness around them. Layla, Amara's mother, was a slight woman with the same large dark eyes as her daughter. She clutched a worn handbag to her chest like a shield. Beside her, Amara was a miniature version of her mother's anxiety, her small hand swallowed up in Layla's. And then there was the man. He was tall and confidently built with sandy blonde hair and a friendly, open-faced smile. He wore a smart casual jacket over a crisp shirt, looking more like he was heading for a pub lunch than a primary school meeting. His arm was draped possessively around Layla's shoulders. He was the one steering them through the crowd, nodding at other parents with an easy charm. Elias's conversation ended. He took a sip of cold tea and waited. His heart began to beat a little faster. When it was their turn, the man strode forward, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his smile wide. "Mr. Vance Ken Barlow, great to finally put a face to the name. This is Layla, and of course you know our little superstar." "Mr. Barlow," Mrs. Aljamil, Elias said, nodding to each of them. He deliberately addressed Layla, but it was Ken who answered. "Please call me Ken. We're all family here," he said, pulling out a chair for Layla before seating himself. He positioned his chair slightly in front of hers, a subtle assertion of dominance. Layla murmured a quiet, "Hello?" her eyes darting nervously around the hall, never quite meeting Elias's. Amara stood silently by her mother, her gaze fixed on a worn patch on the carpet. So Ken began leaning forward with an air of paternal concern. "How's she getting on?" "Settling in all right, is she? Amara is a very bright girl." Elias started keeping his tone even and professional. "She's observant. Her English is improving every day, and she listens well. She's just very quiet." She's a shy one. Always has been." Ken chuckled, patting Layla's knee. "A bit sensitive, you know how it is. Comes from a tough background, what she's been through. We're working on bringing her out of her shell." The words were reasonable, but the subtext made Elias's skin crawl. Ken spoke of Amara's past as if it were a defect he was magnanimously fixing. Elias decided to gently probe. "I did want to mention one small thing," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I've noticed Amara seems much more comfortable standing during lessons. She avoids sitting on her chair. I was wondering if she's mentioned anything about it at home, perhaps a fall or feeling unwell." Ken's smile didn't falter, but a cool stillness entered his eyes. "Kids, full of funny little habits. One week it's standing, the next she'll probably want to do her sums upside down. I wouldn't worry about it." He was dismissing the concern, shutting it down with a casual laugh. Elias pressed on, turning his body slightly to address Layla directly. "Mrs. Aljamil has—" Amara seemed to be in any pain at all. Layla's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. She opened her mouth to speak, a small, hesitant sound escaping her lips. But Ken cut in smoothly before she could form a word. "I handle things at home, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice still friendly but with an undercurrent of steel. He gave Layla's shoulder a squeeze that looked more like a warning than a gesture of affection. "She's got enough on her plate, what with the language and everything. No need to worry her. It's just a phase." Elias felt a flash of anger. He was being stonewalled. He looked at Layla, who had shrunk back into her chair, her face pale. He saw the cage clear as day. He decided to try a different tactic, one that was less direct but held a hidden meaning. "Her artwork is very expressive," Elias said, holding Ken's gaze. "It shows she has a lot of deep feelings. She drew a picture recently that was very powerful." The smile finally vanished from Ken's face. The mask of civility slipped. His voice when he spoke was low and cold, the cheerful facade completely gone. "Look, mate," he said, the casual term of address now a clear sign of aggression. "You're a good teacher, I'm sure. You stick to teaching the ABCs and we'll handle the parenting. She's a good girl. She just needs a firm hand. Discipline. That's something she's not used to, and it's what we're giving her." The phrase "a firm hand" hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken violence. It was a confession disguised as a parenting philosophy. Before Elias could respond, Ken stood up, pulling Layla with him. "Well, lovely to chat. We've got to let the next person have a go. Come on, Amara." He was already turning away, his arm once again draped around Layla, guiding her away from the table. "Thanks for your time, Mr. Vance," he called over his shoulder, the charming smile snapping back into place for the benefit of the other parents in the hall. Elias sat frozen in the small chair, the low hum of the room returning to his ears. He watched them leave, Ken leading Layla, following like a shadow, and Amara, a silent ghost, trailing behind them. His hands were trembling slightly. He hadn't seen a bruise or heard a confession. But in that public forum, surrounded by the cheerful evidence of childhood, he had seen the truth. He had seen the fear in Layla's eyes, the control in Ken's grip, and the chilling promise behind his words. His suspicion was no longer a vague feeling in his gut. It was a cold, hard certainty. And the fight to protect Amara had just become intensely personal. The encounter at the parent-teacher evening left Elias with a profound sense of urgency. Ken's veiled threats and Layla's palpable fear had transformed the situation from a worrying mystery into a clear and present danger. His meticulously kept log felt like a collection of useless trivia in the face of such raw, menacing control. He knew he had to reach Layla to create a channel of communication away from Ken's suffocating presence. His first attempt was a carefully worded note sent home in Amara's school bag. It was disguised as a standard follow-up sealed in an official school envelope. Dear Mrs. Al-Jamil, it was a pleasure to meet you and Mr. Barlow on Tuesday. Following up on our conversation, I would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss some strategies to help Amara feel more comfortable in the classroom. Please feel free to call me at the school at your convenience. I'm available most mornings before classes begin. Sincerely, Mr. E. Vance. He had deliberately made it sound bureaucratic and bland, hoping it would pass under Ken's radar. He watched Amara slip the envelope into her bag, his hopes resting on that flimsy piece of paper. Days passed. The phone in the staff room remained silent. Each morning, Elias would check his voicemail with a nod of anticipation, only to be met with the automated voice telling him there were no new messages. Layla did not call. He saw the result of his attempt in Amara. The following Monday, she seemed even more withdrawn. The dark circles under her eyes were more pronounced, and she flinched when he approached her desk, a new sharp fear in her movements. He knew with a sinking heart that the note had been found and that its discovery had likely led to repercussions. He had to try a different approach, something more direct. He knew it was a risk, a breach of professional boundaries, but the image of Layla's terrified face gave him no choice. He found her address in the school's confidential records, a flat in a council estate a few miles away, a place of grim uniformed tower blocks that stood like concrete sentinels against the sky. On Wednesday afternoon, after the last of the children had been collected, he drove there. The building was even more imposing up close, the air thick with the smell of damp and disinfectant. He found the flat number and pressed the buzzer, his heart thudding against his ribs. He waited. For a long moment, there was only silence. He was about to press it again when the intercom crackled to life. Yes. The voice was Layla's, but it was thin and wary. Mrs. Al-Jamil, it's Elias Vance, Amara's teacher, he said, speaking clearly into the small grill. I was just in the area and was hoping for a quick informal chat, just for a moment. The silence that followed was heavy with indecision. He could almost feel her fear radiating through the electronic connection. He is not here, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. The click of the door unlocking was a small, sharp sound of surrender. He took the clattering lift to the 5th floor. The corridor was dimly lit and narrow. She opened the door just a crack, peering out at him. She was wearing a simple headscarf and a faded cardigan. The flat behind her was sparsely furnished but tidy. You should not have come here, she said, her voice trembling. She didn't invite him in. I'm sorry to intrude, Elias said softly, keeping his distance. I was worried. I sent a note home and I haven't heard back. Layla's eyes filled with a fresh wave of panic. He saw it. He was very angry. He said, I am not to speak with the school. He said, you're interfering. Interfering with what Elias asked gently. With how we raise her, she stammered, twisting the fabric of her sleeve in her hands. He says Amara needs to be strong. He says you are making her soft. It was the same twisted logic Ken had used at the school, a justification for cruelty. Layla, he said, using her first name, trying to bridge the gap between them. Amara is in pain. I can see it. She is scared. You can tell me what's happening. I can help. She shook her head violently, tears welling in her eyes. You cannot help. You do not understand. Ken, he is helping us with the papers for our right to stay. He says if we cause any trouble, if anyone from the authorities comes here, they will send us back. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. It wasn't just physical intimidation. Ken was using their fragile immigration status as the ultimate weapon. He had made himself their savior and their jailer all in one. To defy him wasn't just to risk his anger. It was to risk deportation, to be sent back to the war-torn country they had fled. Layla was trapped in a cage of profound bureaucratic terror. He would not be able to do that, Layla, Elias said, trying to sound confident. There are laws, protections. He says he knows people. She whispered fiercely, tears now streaming down her cheeks. He says a word from him is all it takes. I cannot lose my daughter. I cannot take her back there. It is better to be quiet, to endure. At least here she is safe from from the other things. The words hung in the air, a devastating admission of her impossible choice. She had traded one war zone for another. "This is not safety," Elias said, his voice filled with a desperate conviction. "What he is doing is wrong, and it is against the law here. Please," she begged, her composure crumbling completely. "Please just leave it alone. You will only make it worse. For Amara, for me. Please, Mr. Vance, go." She began to close the door, her face a mask of misery and fear. Elias put his hand out, not to stop the door, but as a gesture of appeal. "Layla, if you change your mind, if you ever need help, you can find a way to contact me. I will be waiting." She gave a single heartbroken nod, and then the door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the dim, silent corridor. He walked back to the lift feeling as though he'd been punched in the gut. He had tried to offer a lifeline, but her fear was too deep, the anchor of her predicament too heavy. He now understood the true, terrible complexity of her silence. She wasn't just protecting a violent man, she was protecting her child from a fate she believed to be even worse. He had to find proof so undeniable that it would break through not only the walls of the system, but the walls of Layla's prison as well. The closed door of Layla's flat was a definitive end to one path, forcing Elias to find another. He could no longer hope for an ally in Amara's mother. The source of the truth would have to be Amara herself. But how could he ask a terrified 6-year-old to articulate a trauma she had been conditioned to hide, especially with her limited English? The risk of re-traumatizing her, of pushing her further into her shell, was immense. He needed help. He found it in the form of Mrs. Patel, the school's part-time educational psychologist and counselor. She was a calm, gentle woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a wealth of experience in dealing with vulnerable children. Her office was a small, quiet sanctuary tucked away at the end of a little used corridor filled with soft cushions, art supplies, and shelves of picture books. Elias laid out the entire situation for her, the initial complaint, the cold wall of bureaucracy, Amara's disturbing drawing, the tense meeting with Ken, and his failed attempt to connect with Layla. He explained the added complication of the family's immigration status. Mrs. Patel listened patiently, her hands clasped on her desk. When he finished, she looked at him with a deep, empathetic sadness. "You've done everything right, Elias," she said, her voice soothing. "And your instincts are correct. We cannot force a disclosure, but we must create a space where one can be offered freely." Together, they devised a plan. It would be low-key, non-threatening, and framed as a simple activity. Mrs. Patel had a set of laminated picture cards, simple, clear drawings depicting various emotions, actions, and objects. They were tools she often used to help nonverbal or traumatized children communicate. The next afternoon, Mrs. Patel called Amara to her office. Elias was already there, sitting on one of the small chairs, making it seem like a casual, shared activity. The room was warm and filled with soft, natural light. "Hello, Amara," Mrs. Patel said with a warm smile, gesturing to a small table. "Mr. Vance and I were just about to play a little storytelling game. Would you like to join us?" Amara looked from Elias to Mrs. Patel, her expression wary. But the room felt safe, and Elias's presence was a familiar comfort. She gave a small, hesitant nod and sat down on a cushion opposite them. Mrs. Patel spread the cards out on the table. There were faces showing happiness, sadness, anger, and fear. There were cards with a house, a school, a bed, a man, a woman, and a child. There were objects, a ball, a book, a plate of food, a flower. And near the bottom of the pile was a simple, stark drawing of a black belt. "The game is easy," Mrs. Patel explained softly. "We just pick a card and talk about it. Mr. Vance, would you like to go first?" Elias picked up a card showing a bright yellow sun. "This reminds me of playing in the park on a warm day," he said. "It makes me feel happy." Mrs. Patel chose a card with a book. "This is me reading a story before bed. It makes me feel calm." They went on like this for a few minutes, creating a gentle, no-pressure rhythm. Amara watched them, her hands in her lap, her body slowly starting to relax. "Your turn." "Amara." Mrs. Patel said, her voice an invitation, not a command. "You can pick any card you like." Amara's small hand hovered over the pictures. She hesitated. Then her fingers landed on the card, showing a small girl alone with large, sad eyes. She didn't say anything, just pushed it forward. "She looks sad," Elias said gently. "Do you ever feel sad like that?" Amara nodded. "What makes you feel sad?" he asked. She looked down, her voice a whisper. "When loud noises." She nodded again. Slowly, carefully, they began to piece together a narrative. Elias would point to a card. At home, he'd ask, pointing to the picture of the house. Amara would nod. He'd point to the card of the man. "Does the man get loud?" A long pause. Then another nod. He pointed to the angry face. "Does he look like this?" This time she flinched. A clear, sharp nod. They were building a vocabulary of shared understanding, a language of images that bypassed the need for complex sentences. Elias felt a knot of dread and vindication tighten in his chest. He reached for his phone, which he had placed on the table, and discreetly activated the voice recorder app. He knew the legal gray area he was entering, but Mrs. Patel gave him a subtle, affirming nod. This had to be documented. "Amara," he said, his voice soft as felt. "What happens? What does the man do when he is angry?" She stared at the cards, her breathing shallow. Her gaze moved past the picture of the shouting mouth, past the angry face. Her eyes landed on the final card, the black belt. Her entire body tensed. She reached out a trembling finger and tapped the picture of the belt, once, twice. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of children playing outside. "The belt?" Elias asked, his own voice sounding strained to his ears. She didn't nod this time. She looked up, her eyes wide and filled with a stark, terrible certainty. She met his gaze directly. "It hurts," she whispered, the same two words she had spoken to him that first morning. "When I sit." Then she added one more, a single word in English that shattered the last of his composure. "Always." Mrs. Patel reached out and gently placed a hand on Amara's arm. Elias slowly, carefully stopped the recording. He had it. A quiet, fragmented, and utterly devastating testimony. It wasn't a confession he had coerced. It was a truth she had finally been given the tools to tell. He now held her voice in his hands, and he would make sure the world was finally forced to listen. The audio recording was a powerful weapon, but Elias knew it might still be dismissed as ambiguous, the leading questions of a concerned teacher influencing a suggestible child. He and Mrs. Patel had documented their session meticulously, but the system he had learned fed on irrefutable facts. He needed something that couldn't be explained away. He needed to see. The following week was Sports Week at St. Jude's. The carefully planned curriculum was replaced with a series of chaotic but joyful athletic events. On Tuesday, the playground was set up with a miniature obstacle course made of low hurdles, hoops to crawl through, and beanbags to balance on heads. The air was filled with squeals of excitement and the thud of trainers on tarmac. Elias was in charge of the finish line, handing out stickers and cheering on the flushed, triumphant faces that crossed it. He tried to keep the mood light, but his eyes were constantly scanning for Amara. She participated, but with a cautious reluctance that set her apart from her peers. She moved through the course with a slow, deliberate grace, as if carefully monitoring every movement of her body. She did not run. She navigated. The final obstacle was a low, soft mat that the children had to somersault over. It was Amara's turn. She approached the mat, her expression tense. She looked at it, then back at Elias, a flicker of panic in her eyes. The other children waiting in line behind her began to get restless. "You can do it!" Amara, a classmate, shouted. She took a deep breath, knelt down, and tucked her head in. But instead of rolling forward in a fluid motion, her body seemed to lock up. She lost her balance and tipped over sideways, landing awkwardly on the mat with a soft thud. It wasn't a hard fall, more of an ungainly tumble. Immediately she scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment. Elias was by her side in an instant, his hand gently on her back. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" "That was a bit of a wobble," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. She nodded quickly, refusing to meet his eyes, already trying to brush herself off and move away. But as she did, her cardigan, which she always wore, buttoned up regardless of the temperature, had ridden up her back. And the sleeve of her polo shirt, tugged by the fall, had slid up past her elbow. That's when he saw it. For a single sickening moment, the world seemed to stop. Against the pale skin of her upper arm, stretching towards her shoulder, were 3 distinct marks. They were long, thin, and horrifyingly clear. They weren't the mottled circular shape of a common playground bruise. These were straight, parallel lines, a dark, angry purple edged with a sickly yellow-green. They looked like stripes, like the welt left by a strap swung with force. The sight was so stark, so violent that it stole the breath from his lungs. It was the physical manifestation of the story she had told with pictures and whispered words. It was the concrete proof Ms. Reed had demanded. Amara, sensing his sudden stillness, looked down at her arm. Her eyes widened in horror. With a gasp, she yanked her sleeve down, pulling her cardigan tight around her, as if to physically push the evidence back into hiding. But it was too late. He had seen. His mind, which had been a whirlwind of doubt and frustration for weeks, was now utterly icily clear. The time for observation, for documentation, for quiet conversations was over. He put a steadying hand on Amara's shoulder. "Amara, I need you to come with me to the office, okay? You're not in any trouble. Everything is going to be all right." His voice was calm, but it held a new, unshakable authority. Leaving the other children in the capable hands of the teaching assistant, he led Amara by the hand away from the noisy playground. She walked beside him, her head bowed, a silent, trembling figure. He didn't take her to Ms. Reed's office. He took her to the small, quiet medical room, sat her down on a chair, and gave her a glass of water. "I'll be right back," he promised. He walked out, closed the door, and strode down the corridor, his footsteps echoing with purpose. He didn't knock on Ms. Reed's door. He walked straight in. She was on the phone and looked up, surprised and annoyed at the interruption. He didn't wait for her to finish. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and firm, leaving no room for argument. "Amara Al-Jamil has visible non-accidental injuries on her upper arm, consistent with being struck by a belt. I've seen them with my own eyes. You need to call the police and children's services. Right now, Miss." Reed's expression shifted from irritation to shock. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. She saw that the line had been crossed. She put the phone down without another word. "Show me," she said. He led her to the medical room. He knelt in front of Amara, his voice softening. "Amara, sweetheart, can you show Ms. Reed your arm? The part that hurts." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, but she looked at Elias, and in his face she saw not anger or disappointment, but a promise of safety. Slowly, her small, trembling hand reached up and pushed back her sleeve. Ms. Reed let out a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The bruises were undeniable. They were brutal. They were the truth written on a child's skin. She looked at Elias, all protocol and procedure momentarily forgotten, her face pale with horror. "I'll make the call," she said, her voice shaking slightly. As she left the room, Elias turned back to Amara. He took a sticker from his pocket, a gold, glittery star, the kind he gave out for exceptional work, and placed it gently on the back of her hand. "You were so brave," he whispered. "The bravest I've ever seen." He knew that a long, difficult road lay ahead. But in that small, quiet room, the first most important battle had just been won. The silence had been broken not by a sound, but by an image so clear and so terrible that no one could ever ignore it again. The arrival of the authorities was quieter than Elias had anticipated. There were no wailing sirens, no flashing lights, just a plain, unmarked car that pulled up discreetly outside the school gates less than an hour later. Two people emerged, a uniformed police officer, a woman with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, and a social worker from Children's Services, a man named David with kind, tired eyes. They were led to Ms. Reed's office, which had become the incident's command center. The atmosphere was thick with a tense, hushed gravity. Elias recounted his story for what felt like the 100th time, but now his words carried the undeniable weight of physical evidence. He detailed Amara's first statement, the drawing of the broken doll, the recording of her testimony, and finally, the bruises. Ms. Reed, her professional composure now restored, but her expression grim, corroborated the visual confirmation. While they spoke, Mrs. Patel stayed with Amara in her quiet office, reading her a story and keeping her insulated from the storm of adult activity. "We'll need to speak with the child," David, the social worker, said when Elias had finished, "and a forensic medical examination will have to be arranged." "She's terrified," Elias said, a protective instinct surging through him. "Please be gentle with her. That is always our first priority," Mr. Vance, the police officer, assured him, her voice professional but not unkind. They moved to Mrs. Patel's office. David knelt down to speak to Amara, his voice incredibly soft. He explained in the simplest possible terms that they were people whose job it was to keep children safe, and that they needed to take her to a special doctor who would make sure she was okay. Amara looked past him, her eyes searching for Elias. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. She didn't speak, but she allowed David to take her hand. The next few hours were a blur of protocols and paperwork. Elias watched from the window of the staff room as Amara was led to the unmarked car. She looked so small, a tiny figure being swallowed up by the vast complex machinery of the state. It felt like a necessary betrayal, handing her over to strangers, even if it was for her own protection. An emergency protection order was granted by a magistrate that afternoon based on the evidence. Amara would not be going home. Ken and Layla would be questioned. For now, Amara would be taken to a foster home, a temporary placement known as a place of safety. Elias went home to his empty flat that evening, the silence ringing in his ears. The classroom, which had been the stage for this entire drama, felt miles away. He couldn't eat, he couldn't rest. He just kept seeing the stripes on Amara's arm, the terror in Layla's eyes, and the false charming smile on Ken's face. He received a call the next day from David. The medical examination had confirmed non-accidental injuries, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a belt-like object. Amara had been placed with an experienced foster carer in a quiet suburban house on the other side of London. "She's asking for you, Mr. Vance," David said. "She's barely spoken a word to anyone else. It's a bit unusual, but given your role in this, we think a visit might help stabilize her. It would have to be officially supervised, of course." "Yes," Elias said without a moment's hesitation. "Whatever it takes. Just tell me when and where." 2 days later, he found himself sitting in the unfamiliar living room of a stranger's house. It was clean and warm, filled with soft furnishings and the smell of baking. Amara was sitting on a large sofa opposite him, her legs tucked underneath her. David, the social worker, sat in an armchair in the corner, a silent but observant presence. Amara looked different. She was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, a soft pink jumper and leggings, and her hair was down, framing her pale, anxious face. The house was a sanctuary, but she was still a prisoner of her own fear. Elias smiled, trying to project a sense of normalcy he was far from feeling. He had brought a bag with him. He reached into it and pulled out a brand new set of drawing pencils and a thick pad of clean white paper. "I thought you might have run out," he said softly, placing them on the coffee table between them. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, flickered up to the pencils. He pulled out a second item, a beautifully illustrated children's book about a little bear who gets lost but finds his way home to a new, better cave. He didn't read it aloud, just placed it beside the drawing pad. A silent offering. She didn't move for a long time. Then slowly she uncurled herself and slid off the sofa. She walked to the table, her small hand hovering over the gifts. She picked up a blue pencil. They said I'm not going home," she whispered the first word she had spoken to him. Elias's heart ached. He chose his own words with infinite care. "For now, you're going to stay here in this safe house. The grown-ups are going to make sure that your home becomes a safe place too. And until it is, you will be safe here." Her dark eyes searched his, looking for the lie, the false reassurance. He met her gaze with absolute sincerity. "Amara," he said, leaning forward. "Do you remember that first day when you told me you were hurting?" She nodded. "You were so brave to tell me. And now you don't have to be the only brave one anymore. All of us," he said, gesturing to include David, the foster carer he couldn't see in the kitchen, "and the whole invisible system, we are all going to be brave for you now. You will not be alone in this, I promise." She looked at him for a long moment, a silent, solemn appraisal. Then she turned back to the pad of paper. She began to draw. It wasn't a broken doll this time. It was a simple house with a garden and a bright, shining sun above it. A house without any shadows in the windows. He knew it was just a drawing, a child's wish on paper. But it was also a seed of hope. In this strange, sterile sanctuary, she had found a small patch of ground to plant it, and he would be there to help it grow no matter how long it took. The days following Amara's removal were a maelstrom of official activity. A police investigation was formally launched. Ken, when brought in for questioning, was reportedly calm, charming, and utterly dismissive. He painted a picture of a troubled, untruthful child and an overzealous teacher. He denied everything. Layla's situation was more complicated. When the police arrived at the flat, she was gone. The place was neat, almost sterile, with no sign of a struggle, but her few personal belongings had vanished. Neighbors reported seeing her leave with a small suitcase, her face pale and drawn the night Amara was taken into care. Ken claimed he had no idea where she was, suggesting she'd buckled under the pressure and run off. The official narrative began to form a frightened, unstable mother, possibly complicit, who had abandoned her child and fled. Elias refused to believe it. He remembered the raw, desperate terror in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a woman who would abandon her daughter. It was the look of a woman who felt she had no other choice. Weeks turned into a month. Amara was slowly settling into her foster home. Elias visited her every Friday, the sessions supervised by David. They were the anchor of his week. He brought her new books and more art supplies. They rarely spoke of what had happened. Instead, they built a new world of stories and drawings, a fragile space where she could begin to feel like a child again. But a shadow still hung over her. "Is my mummy coming?" she would ask sometimes, her small voice filled with a hope that broke his heart. Then, on a cold, drizzly Tuesday afternoon, it happened. He was in the middle of marking a stack of spelling tests when the school secretary buzzed his classroom. "Mr. Vance, you have an email. It's marked urgent and personal." His heart skipped a beat. He logged into his school email account, his hands suddenly clumsy. The email was from an anonymous auto-generated address, the kind used by public computer terminals. The subject line contained just one word, Amara. He clicked it open. The text was formatted simply without any capital letters, as if typed in a great hurry. "Mr. Vance, I pray this finds you. I'm sorry. I did not run away from Amara. I ran away from him. That night the police came. He told me it was my fault. He said you had called them, and now they would take Amara and send us back. He said I had to choose, him or them. He said if I did not go with him, he would find me and hurt me." I believed him. I was so scared. He took me to a place. I do not know where, but I left. Yesterday, I walked for many hours. I'm in a library now. I saw on the computer about a place for women, a refuge. I will go there. He is not at the flat. He is staying at his friend's garage, a car repair place near the old market in Southwood Green. He goes there every day. He thinks I'm too stupid and scared to tell anyone. Please, tell the police. Show them this. I'm not abandoning my daughter. I'm trying to come back to her. Lila Elias read the email twice, his breath catching in his chest. It was a raw, desperate cry for help, a message sent from the depths of her fear. She hadn't fled from her responsibilities. She had fled for her life. And in her first moment of freedom, she had used it not just to save herself, but to bring Ken to justice. It was an act of staggering courage. He printed the email, his hands trembling. This was it. This was the key. It was Layla's testimony, her corroboration. It placed Ken at the scene, it described his threats, and most importantly, it gave the police a location. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to Ms. Reed's office, the printed sheet of paper in his hand. He placed it on her gleaming desk without a word. She read it, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to astonishment. She looked up at him, her sharp eyes wide. "This changes everything," she said, her voice filled with a new sense of gravity. "Yes," Elias said, "it does." She picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. "This is Evelyn Reed at St. Jude's Primary," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "I need to speak to Detective Constable Fisher regarding the Al Jamil case. It's urgent. We have new evidence, a direct communication from the mother." Elias stood by the window looking out at the gray, rain-swept playground. He thought of Layla alone in a public library, pouring her fear and hope into a message, a digital life raft thrown out into the vast, anonymous ocean of the internet. And he thought of Amara drawing pictures of a safe house, waiting for a mother she feared she had lost forever. The police had dismissed Layla as a flight risk. Ken had underestimated her as a victim. But they were both wrong. She was a survivor. And with her brave, desperate message, she had just given them the weapon they needed to finally win the war. Layla's email acted as a catalyst. The police, armed with a specific location, and the mother's direct testimony describing coercion and threats, moved quickly. Ken was arrested the next morning at the garage in Southwood Green. He was reportedly taken by surprise, his charming facade crumbling into angry disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. The subsequent legal process was swift and decisive. Ken's defense, which relied on portraying Layla as an unreliable runaway, and Amara as a fantasy-prone child, collapsed under the weight of the evidence. There was Elias's meticulous log, Amara's heart-wrenching drawing, and the chilling audio recording of her testimony. There was the forensic medical report, which clinically detailed the shape and age of the bruises. And now there was Layla herself. Having found sanctuary in a women's refuge, she emerged as a powerful and credible witness. With the support of counselors and a legal aid lawyer, she recounted the story of Ken's escalating control, his psychological manipulation, and his use of her immigration status as a constant looming threat. Her testimony painted a clear picture of coercive control that culminated in physical violence against her child. The day of the final hearing arrived on a crisp, cold morning. The courtroom was a modern, sterile space designed to be less intimidating than the traditional wood-paneled halls of justice, but the air was still thick with an almost unbearable tension. Elias was there wearing a formal suit that felt stiff and unfamiliar. He wasn't there to testify his written statements had been sufficient, but to offer silent support. In the public gallery a few rows behind him sat Ms. Reed. Her presence was a quiet, profound acknowledgement of how far they had all come. It was no longer just his fight. It was the school's. But the most important person in the room sat at the front, flanked by David the social worker and Mrs. Patel. Amara was not required to be there, but she had insisted. "I want to see." She had told Elias, her voice small but firm. She wore a simple blue dress, and on the collar she had pinned a small, sparkly, star-shaped badge Mrs. Patel had given her for bravery. On the other side of the room, Ken sat next to his lawyer. He looked smaller, diminished in the drab, ill-fitting suit provided by the court. The easy charm was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful glare. He refused to look in Amara's direction. The judge, a woman with a severe expression but kind, attentive eyes, reviewed the final submissions. The case was overwhelmingly strong. The defense offered a weak final plea, citing a difficult upbringing and problems with anger management. The room was silent, holding its collective breath. Finally, the judge looked up from her papers. She addressed the court, but her eyes seemed to find Amara's. In the matter of the Crown versus Kenneth Barlow, she began, her voice clear and resonant. This court has been presented with a deeply disturbing pattern of abuse. It is a case of not only physical violence against a defenseless child, but of profound psychological cruelty, manipulation, and the exploitation of a vulnerable individual. She paused, her gaze shifting to Ken. "Mr. Barlow, you were in a position of trust. You took advantage of that trust in the most contemptible way. The evidence against you is conclusive. Therefore, on the charges of assault occasioning actual bodily harm and child cruelty, this court finds you guilty." A collective silent sigh of relief rippled through the gallery. Elias felt the tension drain from his shoulders. He saw Mrs. Patel reach out and squeeze Amara's hand. The judge continued, her voice hardening. "The sentence for these offenses will be a custodial one of 3 years imprisonment. Furthermore, this court is issuing an indefinite restraining order. You are from this moment forward forbidden from ever making any contact, direct or indirect, with Amara Al-Jamil or her mother, Layla Al-Jamil. Any breach of this order will result in your immediate return to custody." Ken slumped in his chair, his face pale. He looked defeated. The judge then softened her tone, looking directly at Amara again. "Young lady," she said, her voice filled with a gentle respect, "what happened to you was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. You showed a bravery that many adults would struggle to find. This court and everyone in it is proud of you. Your ordeal is now over. You are safe." For the first time that day, Amara's solemn expression broke. A small, slow smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. It lit up her entire being. As the guards led Ken away, his head bowed, Elias felt a profound sense of closure. He looked at Ms. Reed, and she gave him a firm, respectful nod. He looked at Layla, who was sitting with her support worker, tears of relief streaming down her face. And he looked at Amara, who was now chattering quietly to Mrs. Patel, her small hand tracing the outline of the sparkly star on her dress. Justice was not just an abstract concept delivered in a courtroom. It was the feeling in that room. It was the lifting of a great weight, the breaking of a spell of fear. It was the simple, beautiful sight of a child's smile, finally free from the shadow of her tormentor. Spring arrived late that year. But when it came, it painted London in hesitant strokes of green and gold. The cherry blossom trees outside St. Jude's Primary erupted in a riot of pink, their petals drifting like confetti onto the damp pavement. It was a season of new beginnings. 3 months had passed since the verdict. For Amara, it had been a period of quiet, steady healing. Layla, now living in supportive housing and receiving intensive therapy, was slowly rebuilding her life. Her immigration status had been secured, the threat Ken had held over her revealed to be a cruel fiction. Her supervised visits with Amara had progressed from tense, tearful encounters to relaxed afternoons spent drawing and reading in a sunlit family center. The bond between them, though frayed, was beginning to mend. But today was the most significant milestone of all. Today, Amara was coming back to school. Elias stood by the door of his classroom, his hands clasped behind his back, a nervous energy thrumming just beneath his calm exterior. The room was the same, yet different. It felt brighter, more hopeful. The children were settling at their desks, the familiar Monday morning buzz filling the air. He saw her in the doorway, pausing on the threshold. She wasn't flanked by a social worker anymore. Layla stood behind her, offering a gentle, reassuring smile before giving her a small nudge forward and retreating down the corridor. Amara was wearing her navy blue uniform, freshly pressed, and her hair was tied back with a bright yellow ribbon. She carried her pink backpack not like a burden, but like an ordinary piece of equipment for an ordinary day at school. She stepped inside. A few of her classmates turned to look. Some smiled shyly, others whispered her name. There was no fanfare, no dramatic reunion. It was just a quiet, momentous return. She walked with a newfound confidence, her head held high. Her path took her through the maze of small desks and chairs straight towards the back of the room, to the place that had once been her silent battlefield. She stopped in front of the small wooden chair. Her chair. Elias held his breath. The entire classroom seemed to fall silent, a collective, unspoken understanding passing between the children. They were all watching. For a moment she just looked at it. The chair was no longer a symbol of dread, a source of unspeakable pain. It was just a chair. 4 wooden legs, a square seat, a simple back, an object. With a calm, deliberate movement, she reached out, pulled the chair away from the desk, and without a single moment of hesitation, she sat down. She settled into the seat, her back straight, her feet flat on the floor. It was a simple, mundane action, one that was being repeated by millions of children in classrooms all over the world at that very moment. But for her, it was a profound declaration of victory. She looked up, her dark eyes scanning the room until they found his. A radiant, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile so full of light it seemed to chase away every last shadow from the corners of the room. She didn't need to say a word. Elias felt the tight knot he had been carrying in his chest for months finally completely unravel. A wove of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He smiled back, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He turned to the whiteboard and picked up a pen. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice thick but steady. "Let's get started. Today we're going to write a story. It can be about anything you want, but every good story needs a brave hero." He glanced back at Amara. She had already taken out her pencil case and was looking at him, her expression bright and attentive, ready for whatever came next. The class began. The sounds of learning filled the room, the scratching of pencils, the rustle of paper, the soft murmur of children's voices. And in that ordinary classroom, on an ordinary spring morning, something truly extraordinary was happening. A little girl who had once been so broken was finally able to sit in peace and learn how to write her own happy ending. As Elias walked between the desks, he paused beside hers. He leaned down, his voice a low whisper meant only for her. "Welcome back, Amara." She looked up at him, her smile unwavering. "It doesn't hurt anymore, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It doesn't hurt at all."